morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Heather Williams. I'm the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS, and I'm really thrilled to have you all here today to launch our Project Adam 2025 report. I think it's a good cover. I didn't realize I matched the cover when I got dressed this morning. But anyways, I'm really excited to have you all here, and thanks as well to everybody who is tuning in online. Just a couple housekeeping items before we jump into the fun part. This event will be on the record. Also, you can submit your questions using the QR code here in the room, and then you should also have that online. So please do use that during the panels to feed in your questions to the chair, and they will read them out, and we'll do it that way. In terms of building safety, we feel secure in our building, but in the event that you need to, please follow my instructions should the need arise, and just take a moment to find out where the nearest emergency exit is. It's probably that door behind you, just so you know. Those are all the things I think that we need to get out of the way. In terms of what we want to achieve today and why you are hopefully all here and in the right room, the theme for this year's Project Adam study was escalation management in the Indo-Pacific. And thinking about challenges with allies, what are the tools for escalation management to include military, diplomatic, what are some off-ramps that we can consider? And we are really grateful for the Project Adam format that we've been doing for a couple of years now. The idea of it is that we commission 5 very different experts in the field to write their strategy and to answer a set of strategic questions. And so this year we gave them questions about what I just said. What were the stakes? What are the objectives for escalation management in the Indo-Pacific? What are some sort of the different tools that could be used to try to avoid further escalation? The recently released National Security Strategy also touches on some of these issues, recognizing China as a strategic competitor. The strategy argues that, quote, a favorable conventional military balance remains an essential component of strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. However, there's a lot of questions that the NSS leaves unanswered, having to do with what is the role of nuclear weapons? What is the balance between conventional and nuclear deterrence? And what do you know, our study gets after all those questions and tries to offer some initial answers. As I said, the Project Adam study is a recurring project that we do. The 5 experts that we commissioned this year included Mike Albertson, Matt Koslow, Adam Mount, Corey Shockey, and Beck Shrimpton to write their strategies for managing escalation in China. Their papers assess U.S. and Chinese stakes, strategic objectives, escalation risks, and the role of military and diplomatic escalation management tools. And just to highlight what is a real principle behind this study, but also for PONI more broadly, it is engaging with diversity of views. It is having respectful but really open and deep dive conversations about these really hard strategic questions to get after some answers to those challenges. Today is going to be structured with 2 panels. We're going to start off with the first panel that is about trying to diagnose some of the challenges of escalation management, but also the drivers, which is the title of this first panel. And then in the second session, which I'll be chairing, we will talk more about some of the different tools and how to potentially solve those challenges. Before I turn it over to Catherine to get the first panel started, I do want to flag a couple cross-cutting themes and 1 or 2 items that you might just want to keep an ear out for over the course of the discussion. Among the 5 authors, there was surprising agreement. I was surprised, at least, in terms of agreement on some big, broad brush issues. There were also some really stark disagreements. In terms of the areas of agreement, hopefully you'll read the papers and take this away yourself. There was a strong agreement on deterrence as an escalation management tool. There was also strong agreement on there's not a lot of options for arms control, off-ramps, or diplomacy right now. Considering the diversity of the authors, to me, this was a really important takeaway. The areas of disagreement, though, largely kind of focused around that balance of nuclear and conventional. And so I think we're going to get after that a lot today. The other cross-cutting themes that I know this panel is going to get into have to do with the role of allies and what is at stake. What is worth fighting for? How do you do that in an escalation management scenario in crisis? The final big theme that I'll flag and then turn it over to the first panel is about acute versus protracted crises. A lot of the thinking and a lot of the literature, both in policy and academia, has been looking at crises from the perspective of really acute challenges. And what we found in a lot of our discussions was, no, what about protracted conflicts? What about those conflicts that can go on for years, such as we have been seeing in Ukraine, though there would be obvious differences in the Indo-Pacific. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Catherine to chair this panel and get us started. So great, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Heather. Welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Pack. I'm a Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Australia Chair here at CSIS, and welcoming you to our first panel on drivers of escalation. So we have a really great group up here on stage. To my right, we have Rebecca Shrimpton, who is the Australia Country Director at the Asia Group, Corey Shockey, who is Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and then our discussant for this panel is Tom Caracco. He's the Director of Missile Defense Project and Senior Fellow in the Defense and Security Department at CSIS. So the way we'll run this is I'll turn to the panelists to each give about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes of a discussion on their papers, and then over to Tom for some reflections from him, and then we'll move to questions. So as was mentioned before, please feel free to start entering your questions as you have them. I have an iPad up here, so I'll be able to track everyone. So even if you're in the room, please enter via the QR code. I have some questions myself as well for the great panelists here. So we'll kick it off. Over to you, Beth.
Okay, thank you so much. First and foremost, I really do thank CSIS, PONI, Heather, Lachlan, Elena, the whole team. It's been a terrific experience to be involved in this study, and I think it was really interesting for all of us to weave in the regional perspective. I found it was a great opportunity to air some diversity of views and some different perceptions, but also to open the aperture on options for how we work together and what we do. So just at the moment, I'll try and gallop through some of the sort of high points, I think, or the key points of my contribution to the study, and focusing on the most likely scenarios for crisis or conflict in the Indo-Pacific, as well as primary escalation pathways to nuclear use. So there are numerous and I think increasingly complex scenarios in which either a crisis or a conflict could emerge between the United States, its allies, and China in the Indo-Pacific. I think here the growing connection between security, economics, and technology is creating multiple opportunities for both intentional as well as inadvertent, including kinetic interactions between many regional powers, not just the US and China. And I think that framing sometimes within the region of a US-China competition does mean that allies feel slightly marginalised or don't feel like they have agency in a process where I think it's incredibly important that they do. Competition can quickly escalate into conflict, and this defies the linear progression along the spectrum of conflict that we in Western strategic thinking tend to prefer. China is definitely most comfortable operating in the grey zone, that area where established rules are pushed to breaking point, where propaganda and interpretation can shape both perception and reality. And in this environment, norms are steadily eroding, while China's access across economic, technological, and security domains are continuously reshaping the status quo. For example, China's circumnavigation of Australia in February and March of this year served as a clear signal of its intent to project power in the region. It has since and is currently now undertaking an effort that is even more global in its reach and its capacity, and a demonstration of its power. Now, the timing for this was inconvenient at best for Australia. It was picked up by an airline pilot. The live fire drills disrupted airline traffic to and from Australia and New Zealand. This was clearly not a friendly act, although by definition it was within the parameters of international law. Australia's response was awkward. New Zealand's response was fascinating. It was really within the population, particularly New Zealanders. I think they almost overnight doubled their defence budget. And they were very disturbed. The issue was downplayed very much in Australia with this normal behaviour of what great powers do. I think that was a huge missed opportunity for strategic communications. Now, China's persistent push to assert excessive maritime claims, its rejection of conventions for risk reduction, including refusing communication efforts, they are steadily increasing the risk of crisis. US defence reporting highlights the dramatic rise in dangerous and unprofessional intercepts, both in the air and at sea in the South China Sea. We're talking literally hundreds of incidents, and it could take just one of those to result in loss of life for either the Americans, Australians, Japanese, Philippines, etc. And I think that's hugely concerning, more concerning than I think we're all giving it the credit for. Now, China's efforts to refuse to engage, or its refusal to engage in communications despite ongoing US efforts, really worsens the situation. And I think, again, that's another opportunity for us to call out behaviour that is not helpful in terms of instability in the Indo-Pacific. Now, China's risky behaviours, they are primarily aimed at challenging US and allied access and freedom of manoeuvre in the region. Most of the incidents do involve US military assets, but there's been a rapid increase in those of allies as well, with lives put at risk. There is a real possibility, I think, that China will underestimate the potential reaction should loss of life eventuate in one of these incidents. And I think it believes too strongly in its capacity to control escalation in such a circumstance. Now, neither the US nor China wants a war. The US alliance system supports US power projection, and it serves as a deterrent to China by vastly complicating the task of developing credible theories of victory for a conflict with the US. Our alliances introduce uncertainty about how allies would respond in a conflict, what capabilities they could bring to the fight. China's actions in the region are clearly aimed at testing and creating divisions within this alliance network. Without strengthened coherence and unified effort among the US and its allies, I think China perceives key opportunities to split really important allies apart. At the same time, of course, it is building its own, very different in character, I would argue, but its own strategic set of relationships with Russia, North Korea, and to a lesser extent, Iran. Now, on specific scenarios for escalation of concern, again, these are numerous, but I'll race to a couple and we may be able to unpack some of these in conversation. Clearly, Taiwan features at the absolute top of the list, whether that be fait accompli, a military fait accompli, an opportunistic attack, forced integration, blockade, or any other means. This miscalculation resulting from incidents that we discussed just earlier, the efforts to undermine alliances through coercion and creating intentional distrust, the lack of communication channels, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or systems of national significance, hostile actions in space and Chinese ambitions, stated ambitions to dominate the domain, economic coercion, and I would add technological fait accompli. I think that's one that we need to consider a little bit more deeply. Now, China does believe well, certainly there's been argued that China believes it can control escalation, certainly up to the nuclear threshold. So it has an overconfidence in its ability to control escalation dynamics. And I think this is potentially a real misjudgment. I think if China were to take Taiwan either by force or by coercion below the military and certainly below the nuclear threshold, this is actually an existential threat for the United States. It would undermine American credibility to allies. It would undermine its access and influence in the region. It would place Japan and South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and other key partners in a really perilous situation and to face very difficult challenges. Without confident and assured allies, the US could find its power in the most important region in the world diminished. Now, Western powers are slow to react, and they've often required significant provocation. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, is a case in point. And while caution is always appropriate, it really can be perceived, particularly by authoritarian actors, as weakness. And this potentially opens yet another door for escalation and miscalculations, again, around US and allied resolve. Now, democratic alliances, while they're challenging to manage, are very powerful when they convey unity of purpose and effort. Major escalation risks reside in the fact that neither the US nor China truly understands the other's thresholds and red lines. Misunderstandings could easily trigger sensitive issues that prompt escalation, including to the nuclear realm, simply due to this lack of clarity about why certain systems or interests matter to the other. Unexpected escalation is always possible. I think it's likely or probable that the US may resort to nuclear use in situations that China does not anticipate. I think too, the US may underestimate China's willingness to use all means available to act on Taiwan. China may very well, especially in current circumstances, underestimate the importance of Taiwan to US and allied interests, and I would extend that to even European, to the Euro-Atlantic theatre. A big sort of hobby horse of mine, I'll try not to dwell on this too long, but space and cyber I think are both particularly challenging but critical domains. I think the US has significant opportunities to exercise escalation control and enhance deterrence through these areas than through more conventional and traditional military means, particularly by leveraging alliances. Focusing on space superiority, building resilient and responsive space capabilities in the Indo-Pacific should be a priority to support nuclear deterrence. The US should also heavily invest, as should its allies, in offensive cyber capabilities. Information control is vital for the CCP's hold on domestic power, which makes space and cyber fundamentally information domains increasingly strategic in US-China competition. Investments in missile defence and strategic strike capabilities are key, but they must be credible if they are to be effective deterrents. The relationship between offensive and defensive systems, I think, has always been central to the concept of deterrence, and I think that relationship is in a very interesting stage, particularly when you introduce new technologies and the opportunities that they open up to get a little bit more left of bang, so to speak, for missile defence. I think alliance cohesion at the moment is a risk. I think it's offering an opportunity for China to feel more and more confident in its ability to create division, uncertainty, and to create pause in response. I think it's a real and present danger. I think both the US and its allies must take care not to undermine the strategic and significant advantage that alliances bring to the United States. Now, there is a lot of focus at the moment in the region and a lot of conversation around the current administration's approach to allies and partners. Allies too must accept that there is a burden and an imperative for them to lift their game, so to speak, to recognise that we're in a different paradigm and to really start collaborating in a different way. I think there's a bit of a sense of impunity for China at the moment. It has been able to, what we call salami slice or move, both geographically and strategically in many areas across the Indo-Pacific, which has reduced the space for the United States and its allies to operate in reality. And finally, look, nuclear escalation could result from either the US or China feeling like they're backed into a corner, from the demands of maintaining a protracted war. This is one thing that I think actually could cause one side or the other to push the nuclear button, so to speak, or a surprise event even that catches one or the other on flat-footed or on the back foot, and that leaves them with a lack of perceived options and really just forces them to go nuclear. So a crisis, I think, is the thing that may galvanise the US and its allies at the moment. I think efforts are a little fractured, and I think absent that focal point for us to come together, we are not doing what is needed at the moment to deter and, if necessary, to fight and beat China. It would be a huge mistake to wait for a crisis for us to get our collective acts together. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Corey. Over to you.
So I think that nuclear weapons create enormous stability between possessor states. I do think the balance of terror is more stable than we often credit it. But I would couple that with a second fundamental thing, which is that I think we are dramatically overestimating the ability to manage escalation, I think, on both sides of the US and China. I agree and think Becca's analysis, in particular the allied part, is incredibly strong, and I agree with it, but I actually don't think that's where we are. My sense, so let me start by saying, I always go back to the debate in the Kennedy administration about flexible response. right? The Eisenhower administration believed, I think, kind of like I do, that the possession of nuclear weapons dramatically reduces the risk of great power conflict among possessor states, but it requires a real sense of credibility of the nuclear threat. And the Kennedy administration had a very different concept, that is, that by graduating escalation, you would make it more credible. And I've always found that puzzling, because to wait until you're losing to threaten that you can hold an alliance together and escalate seems to me improbable. The challenge, I think, for escalation management, particularly among nuclear powers, is to impose on your adversary the choice of escalation. And in the Kennedy administration, when they were working this through, a major opponent of the new strategy was the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Norstad. And he famously said, escalation is apt to be explosive. And I think we need to keep that in the back of our mind, because both the Chinese and I think the United States and its allies believe that escalation can be carefully calibrated, and I just think it's unlikely to work that way if you get past the strong damping down pressure that the risk of nuclear war creates for possessor states. My sense is that the Chinese and American objectives for security in Asia are fundamentally contradictory, right? What the United States wants is the status quo maintained. Taiwan's de facto independence, close cooperation among allies on a common approach to China. I'll get to the national security strategy, I promise. Chinese objectives are to intimidate or coerce or compel Taiwan's political reconnection with mainland China, and, if possible, to destroy the credibility of America's alliance relations in the process. And so, in theory, those incompatible objectives should drive us to conflict. And here's where I get to the national security strategy. I read it differently than Heather does. It doesn't seem to me a clarion call for strategic competition between the US and China. It sounds to me like an American surrender of strategic competition with China. That is, for an administration that in its first term in 2016 was castigating the Obama administration for not using the term China and not using the term competition, they are now doing exactly what they criticized the Obama administration doing. Moreover, despite the calls for, military dominance in the region, that's not the military they're buying, and that's not, if the Western Hemisphere is your primary strategic interest and immigration is the biggest threat you see to the United States, both of which are the driving points of the new national security strategy, those will drive in a national defense strategy a reallocation of resources and operations in ways that strike me to be much more like conceding China dominance in the Pacific than a creative way to impose on China the risks of escalation in any conflict. If I were an American ally in Asia, I would be profoundly unsettled by this national security strategy, because I think it aggravates all of the challenges that Rebecca rightly pointed to. I mean, I don't see how you get to an economy of force against China without deep allied participation, and not just allied participation from Asian countries. And I don't see anything in the national security strategy that is going to make that a realistic probability. So this seems to me much more, rather than a sharp-edged strategy for successfully competing with China, this sounds to me a lot more like the transition from British to American hegemony, where the United States conceded without force the rising powers' objectives. And what makes this so curious for me is that actually I think we have probably already seen the peak of Chinese power if we don't concede to them their objectives. China is marooned in the middle income trap. Taiwan has never been more vibrant. Although Chinese manufacturing is gangbusters, I mean, they have 230 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. If you think you're fighting an extended war with China, that's the war-winning advantage for China, unless the U.S. actually crosses the nuclear threshold. So they have, by dint of their manufacturing, imposed on us the escalation requirement. And I worry, especially given the priorities and language of the national security strategy that Trump administration has released, that in a crisis, it wouldn't drive allies together across the Pacific, that you would have a tough-talking Trump administration be unwilling to carry out, be unwilling to escalate and defend its stated objectives in the region. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Corey. Tom, over to you for some thoughts.
Hey, thanks. I really appreciate, Heather, the opportunity to participate today. I want to make sure and get on the NSS stuff. There's at least two of us that sees it this way. Corey, I'm very glad to hear that. Let me just first of all say I'm a big fan. I'm a fanboy of the Project Adam exercise. I was in the first one in 2014, and boy, I tell you what, the center has shifted. Heather highlighted this morning that there was a lot of agreement. You know, back in the heady days of 2014, when, you know, the four horsemen were still riding, you know, a lot has changed, and the calls for disarmament, the calls for these kind of things are far more muted. And I would just note in addition to all the chapters, the Project Adam essay takeaway itself, one of its conclusions is that yes, the U.S. may need to increase its reliance on nuclear weapons and may need to deploy a more diverse set of capabilities in the region. And by the way, the word "in" is, I think, an important word in that formulation. So, I mean, look, the center again has shifted so much, and I think that's really just worth foot stomping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the several kind of questions that you all were required to answer, and I think that is still a very useful methodology, and just make some quick comments, for instance. And Corey, well, actually, let me talk about the NSS real quick here, because I'm glad to hear you say that, because I totally see it in a similar way, and we're actually going to do an event on the NSS this afternoon, which is that, I mean, I just see some contradictions in there, notwithstanding all of the kind of pontificating about the elite opinion of the past being foolish, and how, you know, we used to think that we could make China nice by making them rich and all this kind of stuff. Well, now they seem to kind of be, you know, looking for economic security over everything else. In fact, in the NSS, the effort to increase the defense industrial base capability is a subset of economic security. So I see a lot more of the economics, trade, and tariffs far more than I do, notwithstanding the words, the whole peace through strength claims. A lot of tough talk, But in terms of the reality of where they put their focus, I think that's it. And Corey, you also said something along the way of, in theory, it's the rise of China, the indisputable rise of China from their navy and their rocket forces and all this kind of stuff that may make conflict inevitable. And I think that's a useful observation as well. I think that the whole Thucydides trap is kind of underrated. We were talking about this beforehand. It's sometimes poo-pooed that, if you think war is inevitable, as Pericles did, that will make it inevitable. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, no, it was the rise of Athens and then the creation of the Spartan and Athenian empires in competition that, as you said, are kind of incompatible. And I think that should be bracing in terms of the recommendations of, are we doing enough on the conventional side, on the nuclear side, and on the willingness to escalate. That was something that you both kind of talked about. I can't help but quote Herman Kahn, who said, the best way to look willing is to be willing. And so we have to ask ourselves, would we be willing to escalate first, or would we chicken out in a crisis? So in terms of the stakes, I'm going to first of all quote you, Corey, from I think the first page of your paper. Reifying escalation prevention as an end in itself prejudices the analysis because the only way to prevent escalation is to cede the political objectives for which conflict was accepted. I mean, not to overly simplify, but the emphasis, and I would say the kind of mulling around with things like escalation and this kind of stuff, it kind of calls to mind the better red than dead. And when you think about nuclear weapons as absolutely bad and absolutely worth avoiding, you begin to get there in terms of where you think about this. You also talk about the letting China conquer Taiwan would collapse confidence in U.S. willingness to uphold the sovereignty of other allies. And I think that's true, but I wonder whether that reality has really sunk in. I wonder if we're scared enough in terms of ourselves, in terms of the Japanese, in terms of Australia. And I think it's the case that there was not endorsement of allied independent nuclear capability in these chapters, but you do wonder if the Japanese, if the Australians don't get our act together, as you said, Beck, fast enough, whether it's going to be plausible to rely upon conventional blunting means, conventional deterrence, deterrence by denial, or whether we will have to, as the PONI chapter says, rely upon not just nuclear weapons, but frankly the willingness to go first. And frankly, I'll say one nice thing about the Biden nuclear posture review here is they did not endorse no first use. And when you're in a bad position, it's precisely in that kind of situation where you might have to think about that. Let's see, going to the escalation risks. Beck, you talked about the United States and its regional allies need to contemplate limited or total blockades, limited invasion, a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, A2AD stuff. This is kind of what I was talking about there a minute ago. Is I agree with all that, and the possible use of nuclear weapons for carefully calculated effects. I think we're in violent agreement. I don't think we're doing enough on that front. We don't seem to be seized of that sufficiently. And Corey, you gave 4 primary escalation risks, and I want to highlight 2 of them. One, we always talk about Taiwan. It gets a lot of attention. I always think it could be something with the Philippines, and you call that out, that either China goes after the Philippines, Japan, Australia, or South Korea, number 1. Number 2, that China accidentally engages military forces, fishing boats, sometimes kind of escalates in unexpected ways. And to kind of go back to the Thucydides theme there a minute ago, once you knew that war was going to be inevitable between Sparta and Athens, it kind of didn't matter what the particular spark was. The particular spark in that case was kind of accidental, for instance. And I think that's important to remember, precisely because everybody just seems to focus on Taiwan. Beck, you say, and this, I'm going to repeat myself here, but dispersed conventional long-range standoff and precision strike missiles located within credible ranges of key targets. would signal a nascent combined capability. And I'll just say, yay verily, Typhon rockets in boxes all over the region would be fantastic. I'm curious kind of what you're thinking about there. Australia is geographically far away from some of these things, and so you need to be able to get to the weapons engagement zone or bring your weapons engagement zone closer. And we'll also be curious to think about kind of the next steps. Australia's getting Tomahawk, and that's great. You'll be able to go on their Aegis ships, perhaps ground-launched Tomahawks as well. But what's next? Is it going to be PRISM, for instance? Is it going to be some other things to get the sufficiency of conventional strike to contribute on that side? And then, Corey, you comment that the more integrated and publicly acknowledged conventional and nuclear forces are, the less likely China or allies are to believe that the U.S. would fail to escalate, and the stronger the forces. And I would say, yes, we can integrate them, we can test them, we can practice them, but if, in the end of the day, there's either not enough of them, or we don't, no kidding, don't have the will to go first, then is that going to be sufficient? My second favorite quote from you, Corey, is that you sort of lay it out there. The off-ramps and other risk reduction strategies hold little potential in a China-U.S. conflict involving Taiwan. I think that's right. And that kind of goes to the thesis of the it's going to get ugly and it's going to get ugly fast. And they're probably counting on that, and they have the advantage, probably, if it goes fast, if they can surprise us. I do want you talk about strengthening deterrence, and you say expanding the nuclear arsenal, establishing true ballistic and cruise missile defenses, and then some other things. I'm curious what you mean by true ballistic and cruise. I have some answers, but go ahead.
I think a missile defense that can only defend you against onesies and twosies or have particular apertures on the radars the Chinese can work around that so easily. And so I think we talk ourselves into a false sense of security that we're going to have an actual golden dome that can make impregnable the territory of our country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely agree. We got to do a whole heck of a lot more. I think the Golden Dome initiative has some potential for that, but I'll believe it when I see it. I don't think we're ever going to get something impregnable, and it would be foolhardy to think or to try to do something impregnable. But nevertheless, there's a whole lot that can be done on the limited side of protecting certain things selectively, and to doing so with robust bubbles, for instance. So I think I'll probably leave it there. Curious to get any reactions from you folks, and again, appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Well, we already have several questions in, so again, make sure to get your questions in, and they'll come up on my iPad. I'm going to pop out to Kai Sato, a GWU student, who says a new Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi recently called for the changes of its country's nuclear posture, such as possible acquisition of nuclear submarines and introduction of U.S. nuclear weapons. Do these policy changes stabilize or destabilize the nuclear power balance in the region? I think that brings up an interesting question when we think about partners and allies, the idea of expanding potentially nuclear deterrence options in the region. What does that mean for deterrence? So let's go maybe to Corey on this one and over to Beck, and then Tom, if you have anything to add on as well.
So I do think allied participation in nuclear missions does strengthen the credibility of extended deterrence, and it does reassure allies that we won't abandon them in crisis, because the routine exercises, the routine consultations do strengthen deterrence. I certainly think it would destabilize the nuclear balance in Asia, and that's the point, right? The Chinese are already destabilizing the nuclear balance in Asia. We destabilize the nuclear balance in Asia by unilaterally eliminating American nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula, just as North Korea was introducing nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. And so I think the challenge is not self-deterring from doing things that actually push China into discomfort. I mean, we keep rushing to reassure the Chinese. We want military to military hot phones. So, and then we have them. The Chinese just won't answer them because they are rightly trying to push the uncertainty level up in order to deter us. And we're letting them do those things, and we shouldn't.
I might try and answer a little bit some of what you raised, Tom, and then also respond to that. I think we really need to consider dispersion as a really important and essential element of strategy. I think we've probably been limited in the way we've thought about this in the past. It's been a little too concentrated, it's been a little too obvious, and it has meant that there are, serious cracks and seams that can be worked around. But there are new ways that we can complicate that system with strike, with conventional strike, being again, allies really lifting their game in their investments and their capabilities. From an Australian perspective, it's been really vexing to think about both strike and missile defence. Our geography has allowed us a certain element of safety, and I would argue potentially complacency when it's come to investing in the kinds of systems that are now critical for our defence. I don't think Australia sees itself as becoming heavily involved in an actual conflict over Taiwan. It probably sees itself more in that supporting role, allowing US force flows, supporting US capabilities, and yes, certainly projecting some capabilities forward, but there are, allies that are much closer with serious capability, which means it probably doesn't make an awful lot of sense for, Australia to take its limited capability too far forward. But we've had to really challenge ourselves in thinking about it. As a landmass, we kind of just went, nah, we can't do missile defence. It's too hard. Which bits do we pick to defend? I mean, how do we actually do this? We are starting to think more about that, and that does involve a much more forward postured and amphibious kind of response. It involves working with allies and partners in the region, including through Southeast Asia and other parts of the region. I hope PRISM's next, but I think we have really struggled. I mean, to be honest, we have really struggled to develop any kind of sovereign capability. Our guided weapons and explosive ordnance program has taken years to get off the ground and arguably has still made no progress. At the moment, what we're calling a win is basically assembly. I don't think that gets us where we need to be. So I think, the lack of urgency around this particular capability and its importance in the escalation dynamics and the potential deterrent strategy of our countries together is fundamentally important. Also, really agree with Corey. I think, the times have changed fundamentally. Was it a mistake to withdraw nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula? At the time, I think everyone thought it was the right thing to do. But now you've got, serious debate in South Korea about whether they should and will invest in developing their own sovereign nuclear capability. That you have the new Prime Minister of Japan talking the way that she is. It not only indicates how threatened countries in the region feel, but how insecure and unsure in some ways about how far that extended nuclear deterrent capability that the US offers us is right now. So there are some holes in our thinking, there are some holes in our strategy that I think we do need to get far more creative about resolving in concrete ways, not in necessarily these sort of economic focus and these other things that are themes that are emerging out of the strategic approach of this administration.
Tom, anything to add?
I'd say a couple things. One, just in terms of the is GWIO going fast enough, for instance? The answer is no. GWIO and AUKUS on paper when it came out sounded awesome. Pillar 2, this, that, and the other thing. We're going to overcome ITAR and all this sort of stuff. And boy, it's gone slow. And precisely because things have changed so much. This is why I did a paper recently on MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime. Nobody talks about MTCR except for me, more than the Australians. And you know what? It's getting in the way. One of the, it's not just overcoming the strong presumption of denial of sending missiles of any significant range of payload. There's an absolute ban on transferring facilities, right? Because we didn't want to see Scud facilities being transferred to client states of the Soviet Union, for instance. Well, I tell you what we need to do right now is transfer some facilities to Australia to start cranking these things out.
Exactly.
Tomahawks can't just be pumping out of Tucson, Arizona. But they are, and the Australian flag is over the production line. But it would be very nice if they were down under for redundancy, if nothing else. So MTCR no longer brings me joy. I think we need to dramatically kind of tear up these old regimes and make missile proliferation to our closest allies a part of our policy. On the nuke side, this is where I think, and I said in the last Project Adam report, I think maybe 2 years ago, that no, we do need to think about, let's just for instance, a nuclear sharing arrangement with the Japanese. Their former prime minister had kind of written something about this. Abe, before he was killed post-2022, said something about this. Look, if we think we're going to be losing, and they may not get to a conventional blunting capability fast enough, then that's where you're kind of driven to logically. And then on the missile defense side, 100% agree with you. I think it's not going to be enough to, well, first of all, it's not possible and it's not wise, as I said earlier, try to defend everything, the continent of Australia. And this is where the expeditionary Land 197B, which is essentially, NASAMS and such, it's got to be important for military facilities. We're not going to be able to defend the population centers first and foremost, and that's okay. Because it's going to be the decapitation of military things that will take us apart much more quickly. And I know that is a sacred cow, but it's not the 1990s anymore.
Not a sacred cow. I'm just trying to imagine Prime Minister Albanese explaining to the Australian people he's going to compromise their security in order to protect military sites. I just don't see that as a practical reality.
Well, I think it's likely that as we do today, we have some limited continent-wide defenses, but we also realize that when it comes to air defenses, especially air and cruise missile defenses as opposed to ICBM stuff, you have to be selective. That is just it is impossible to have a counter UAS on every tree and scrub, for instance. So it's not a pleasant truth. I'm with you. So.
I think as well that's partly what's driven the recent changes in Australian strategy and a recognition that we have got to stop that threat before it gets close enough to get to a significant population centre. And luckily for us, a lot of our military installations are north and west, and hopefully those can do the job. So we are, that's that concept of layering and just trying to get forward and defeat the threat before it gets to the point where it can hit. But we would face, with our resource constraints, we would face really difficult decisions. But I too can't imagine Albanese explaining that, sorry.
It's got to be here in the U.S. when folks figure out what Golden Dome is. We're going to have a lot that's everywhere, or a little bit that's everywhere, but a lot's going to be much more localized.
Great. Well, I'm going to go to something close to my heart in the Australia chair, AUKUS. Going up to Daya from CSIS PONI, one of my colleagues. I'll start with Beck with this one. What was the impact of the AUKUS review on alliance cohesion? While the review was successful, what are the longer term impacts of the review when it comes to alliance cohesion and escalation management? And I'd like to add on to this my own question on AUKUS. You mentioned strategic communications earlier, which was, I think, a really important piece here. When we think about the future of AUKUS, how should AUKUS partners be thinking about strategic communications around AUKUS, both internally to their own countries, regionally, and then vis-a-vis China?
It's an excellent question. There was huge nervousness in the Australian system over the AUKUS review. Even within strategic and military circles, there has been a persistent unease about whether AUKUS was the right choice. Personally, I think conceptually, AUKUS is incredibly important, and it embodies, coalitions of like-mindeds with specific purpose. It embodies the kind of mini-lateral systems that we're starting to see emerge, and that are probably going to be the most effective sort of groupings to respond to crises going forward. But I think back to strategic comms. I mean, the propaganda machine of the Chinese Communist Party made hay from that nervousness, and it fed it It increased the nervousness of our population. It decreased the confidence of our politicians in defending them. They did heartily, and we do, as a system, really strongly believe in and are committed to AUKUS. But imagine being in that position where your most important partner and the key really to the first piece certainly, and the most important, the most immediate, is actually under question. It's under review. That's that is deeply unsettling. Now that came out well, but once again, I think by projecting that lack of confidence and that nervousness, by projecting, what do we do if this all goes wrong? I mean, we are just missing a play on the strategic communications side, and we are completely ceding ground to those who seek to completely undermine initiatives like AUKUS, which are very important. And they just, we allow ourselves to be self-deterred. And communication of confidence is just, we don't realise how important it is. Have you noticed that there are just no failures in Chinese experimentation, in PLA experimentation? There are no failures. Everything goes spectacularly, brilliantly well. I mean, it's just simply implausible. But that's the story. And instead, we sort of flay ourselves for, oh gosh, that didn't work, and we're so behind time, and we're so terrible, and we're so slow. And we are, but I mean, let's think about what we're portraying and conveying if we think that communications matter and deterrence.
I would just rejoin there, which is confidence and swagger is good, but it's also not enough. It's not just tough talk, and this is why, at the end of the day, the relative importance of trade and tariffs relative to, no kidding, peace through strength, I think is the most important disconnect in the NSS, and that you'll know that we're serious when you begin to see base budget DoD increases and not, reconciliation tricks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah. Anything else to add on AUKUS, Corey? Let's go to South Korea. So Frank, I don't know where Frank is from, asks, South Korea faces a visible North Korea nuclear threat and a potential Chinese nuclear threat. Currently, Seoul attempts to deter these threats with a conventional three-axis strategy alongside U.S.'s extended deterrence. Do you think Pyongyang and Beijing see a conventional deterrence strategy as credible? And if not, what kind of capabilities should Seoul pursue to that end? We got into this a little bit with one of the previous questions, but let's go, Corey, over to you, or Tom.
Well, the problem with deterrence is that you only know it was working when it fails. And so the fact that neither China nor North Korea have attacked South Korea suggests to me that at some level deterrence is working.
So far.
So far, it's had a pretty good run since about, 1956 or so. That's not a bad record. And South Korea, I think we mythologize the North Korean strength, when in fact, if North Korea and South Korea went to war, first of all, South Korea would win pretty handily and pretty quickly because they're a first-rate military. And second, the major challenge that Allied forces would face is this stream of North Korean refugees trying to flee to the prosperousness of South Korea. So I think, as Becca so often teaches all of us, the way we talk about this really matters, and we talk down the strengths of ourselves and our allies in an equation where most of the advantages are actually on our side of the equation.
I think the South Koreans have already done a lot on this front. It's their, everybody likes to draw the missile range rings for the North Koreans. Go draw the missile range rings for what the South Koreans have. Their kill chain, if Kim Jong-un ever wakes up one day and does something really crazy, they're going to be there fast. And a couple years back, whenever the North Koreans were launching every month or something, or every couple weeks, the South Koreans would often launch a test like minutes after the North Korean one went off to say, hey, we're going to be there before yours lands. on a bad day. The problem is geography. And while South Korea hasn't been attacked, it is their geographic, I think, and economic ties to China that keeps them hostage. And Australia, you point out, is very far away, but not far away enough. and that includes economic ties as well. And so I guess I worry about, we will all need to be attentive to the economic and military course, because if South Korea could take out North Korea conventionally, China could stop South Korea very quickly and fast as well.
But given the relationship between China and North Korea these days, China might not be all that enthusiastic. I mean, South Korean economic links to China can have positive effects as well as negative effects. If I were the Chinese trying to decide, do I want South Korea or North Korea as an ally, that wouldn't be a hard choice.
Anything else to add on that one, Beth? I have an anonymous question here. With regard to the rise in agreement on increasing nuclear options to strengthen deterrence, how does the U.S. balance the cost of increasing these options, including the time cost, monetary cost, and the potential cost or strategic stability? Why are conventional or non-kinetic options less attractive? Are they less attractive? Is that what we're saying?
I don't think conventional options are less attractive, but conventional options are a lot more expensive than nuclear modernization. The notion that we somehow can't afford the program of record is, again, that's the sound of failure. Of course we can afford it. We are making a choice not to, and it's a bad choice.
I fundamentally agree with that. I was shocked, and I'm not going to be able to recall them off the top of my head, but I was shocked when I looked into the reality of the statistics of how much of the defence budget the nuclear modernisation program takes, and it is not as significant as people believe. This is again a myth that needs to be busted. It's one that has kept other nations certainly away, I think, from so helpful, I guess, in a non-proliferation sense, but has kept others away from going after this capability plus the technology of it. But again, it's something that I think could be an incredibly important Australian contribution to deterrence is investment in space. And there's this same myth that still exists in Australia that space is too expensive, it's too exquisite, it's too difficult for a country like us. We don't need this. We've got the United States. That is not true anymore. With dramatic changes in launch costs, etc. The role that Australia could play in space as part of the alliance, the contribution that could make to missile defence, to just the reconstitution of eyes and ears in the region, around the region. But we have convinced ourselves for a very long time that it's too expensive when it's not. We could really be in the game. So I think this cost concept is interesting, and I do think we should invest more in. I mean, I don't think many of us see space as a conventional military domain, but we should. And for us, I think it would be a huge military gain for really an insignificant element or portion of our national budget.
Sounds like this is piece of the strategic communications, really, is what we're talking about too internally within ourselves.
And yes, again, because we just, we're creating political problems for ourselves by allowing misbeliefs and mistruths to dominate debate in our countries and between our countries. And I think I have a real issue with that.
On the cost thing, I'm old enough to remember when little tweaks, like the low yield D5, it was like, oh my goodness, the sky is falling. Look, this is an expensive enterprise. We have a lot of trade-offs. I want to do lots on Golden Dome. I want to do lots of other things. I want tomahawks cropping up like weeds in the Pacific. But we got to also look for the low-cost abilities, like tweaking the yields. If you really believe that war was coming, what risks would you take in terms of ginning up a nuclear cruise missile or JASM or Tomahawk or something like that. It would not be an LRSO or a SLCM necessarily, but there's things that you could do in extremis that might be faster and less expensive. And I think if winter is coming, then we need to at least put ourselves in a mind to be able to think more quickly on a bad day or bad month.
I'd like to get back to the Golden Dome, as you brought up, which was also mentioned in the NSS. You brought up some of the potential gaps when we think about the Golden Dome and what it might actually be able to achieve. What about how that also affects our alliances and our partnerships abroad and the deterrence effect, or the effect it would have on our deterrence efforts abroad?
So any increase in protection of the American people and America's territory, I think, strengthens extended deterrence. It makes it more credible that the United States would fight in defense of an ally and would cross the nuclear threshold in defense of an ally if you're not trading Los Angeles or San Francisco in order to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's strengthening. I would strongly encourage everybody to read a working paper that Todd Harrison from the American Enterprise Institute wrote on Golden Dome, because he took 4 separate potential force structures and costed them out and also assessed the likelihood of what it could actually provide in terms of defense. And it's not an encouraging picture. I mean, if in the minimalist interpretation, where existing technologies in the next 3 years are which are the terms currently moving forward on Golden Dome, that gets you basically nothing you don't already have. The most expansive version of it is something like $3 trillion, and it still does not achieve protection of the homeland against a really important set of threats. Todd's analysis is superb. I encourage you to consider it. So any improvement of protection of the homeland and people is advantageous, but the cost escalates pretty quickly, and it doesn't actually get you much more than what you already have.
I'll say it real quick. The executive order, everybody forgets about this, but the executive order called for Allied and Theater Missile Defense Review. It was due May 15, by the way. I expect we'll see some verbiage, maybe after the NDS or something like that, maybe stitched into that. But there's a lot of opportunities there. And missile defense, air and missile defense, is not just an American idiosyncrasy. Everybody kind of needs this in some extent because missiles are weapons of choice. In terms of the this is what you're seeing, all these sort of steel shield pop up, which, by the way, I think we should have called it steel shield. We would have gotten the steel workers unions on board overnight and mixed up the political calculus a little bit there. But gold is soft and malleable as well. But look, I will comment, Corey. Yeah, go read Todd's paper. I would say that it's all correct in as much as there's different scenarios of linear projections of different things that we have today, or of notional SBIs. We're not going to spend $3 trillion on this. We're not going to spend $1 trillion on this. And I think that everybody always forgets the air defense piece. And yet that is the center of gravity of the UAS threat and the cruise missile threat. You can get there, and we are going to get there far more cheaply because of, I believe, different points of emphasis and because of preferential defense.
What is preferential defense?
Not defending everything, right? Not trying to defend everything. And so that's where I believe the strategic logic of Golden Dome is to defend the things that a China or a Russia might think that they could attack without rising to the level of the nuclear response. And so taking out not Los Angeles, but taking out Pearl Harbor and Guam, for instance. And that's why taking out the military things, especially in a crisis, to say, hey, you no longer have the ability to do that.
This is a perfect example of why I think escalation control is untenable. The notion that Pearl Harbor goes up and we think, ooh, but we better be careful not to cross the nuclear threshold. Pearl Harbor goes up, you're at war with China. And so the notion that, we can they're carefully calibrating, we just take Pearl Harbor, not San Francisco, and the U.S. is going to be fine with that outcome. I just think that's totally impractical.
I agree, it's impossible to defend everything indefinitely, but if we can defend it long enough for those ships to get out of port, or for the bombers to get in the air off Guam, for instance, it's about doing it long enough to contribute meaningfully that they increases their downside, because you can't do it forever. But we would be at war. I just want to make sure that China has doubts that they may not win that war, that they know that they would be in.
I'd like to go to a question from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. So it talks about the idea of deterrence being based on uncertainty or certainty. So there's a common belief, this question asks, that the credibility of deterrence is fundamentally based on uncertainty. However, given the current instability of the nuclear balance in the Indo-Pacific region and the heightened risk of accidental escalation, I wonder whether it is still appropriate for the United States to adhere to the threat that leaves something to chance as the core of its nuclear strategy. Is that still the core of the nuclear strategy? And any comments on that?
Well, I struggle to think what a strategy of certainty would actually entail.
Look like?
Because you're still having to engage the credibility question of whether you would carry it out. So I'm a little puzzled about what that would actually mean. But I do think that the threat that leaves something to chance, the chance of a nuclear war with another great power, even if it's only 2%, is a pretty bracing prospect. And I think while the number of nuclear possessor states is quite small, so I'm hesitant to make grand theories based on n equals 11 or whatever. So far, the data that we have since 1945 is that it prevents the strongest powers from going to war. But the India-Pakistan recent should, I think, give us pause. I was in India not long ago and was struck to have a senior military person almost giddy as he explained to me that the recent fight with Pakistan expanded the window of conventional war. That is, we can fight a conventional war and it won't go nuclear, therefore India will win. Which, that's an interesting take on the threat that leaves something to chance. But it does suggest that even nuclear possessor states might restrict their crossing the nuclear threshold, even in a fight with each other.
I would only add that I think deterrence has always involved a very careful consideration of what you reveal and what you conceal. So it's both. It's always been a little bit of uncertainty and certainty, and that's theoretically tailored to the situation, and it certainly, I think, should be as it relates to China. I do agree that certainty, while allies want a level of certainty that the US will come to their aid, I don't think most of them necessarily demand anymore the specifics or designated sort of capabilities to be the ones that they get. I think that, again, bringing allies into the planning and into the thinking and into posture is a far more effective way of creating assurance within an extended nuclear deterrence framework than perhaps leaving everything completely unsaid. But
can I answer one other part of the question?
Please.
Which was the notion that there's accidental escalation. I also think that that is a myth. It is almost impossible for me to imagine a political leader stumbling into a nuclear war. They make choices, and the data we have so far is that their decision making gets very analytic as crisis mounts. So I think we have created a notion that wars can happen by accident, and I love the Australian strategist Geoffrey Blaney's repudiation of that wars aren't car crashes. They're steering into the crash. You have to make choices. It doesn't happen like magic or glitter and unicorns. So I think we sometimes are more fearful of accidents when what we should be focusing on is how do we affect the policy choices in a crisis? Because at the end of the day, it's about, do you pursue your political objectives or do you surrender your political objectives?
Sorry, I've just remembered one more thing I was going to say. Certainty, one example is the no first use policy and the consideration that was given at one point to the US taking or taking that no first use approach. I mean, that even for Australia, which, you know, the word nuclear can still create allergic reactions across many communities. We're very nuclear shy. But even our official policy position was that we did not particularly want the US to have a no first use policy because it takes options off the table.
Limits.
And it limits. Now China does have a no first use policy, but we don't believe that for
I
1
was just
second.
going to say, let's see a show of hands in the room. How many people think the United States could fight a war with China and they would say, oh, but we've promised not to use nuclear weapons first? There's no way that's credible, given the political stakes of a war between the U.S. and China.
What I think is really interesting, though, in this particular example, is this shows that people do believe that the US adheres to its own policy to an extent.
That's a nice point.
And that's important in an alliance context. Really important.
And I'm going to use wars, not glitter and unicorns, in my next policy paper somehow. Let's wrap up with one last question, sort of a general overarching question from Gabriella writes from the Council on Foreign Relations. Is extending nuclear deterrence through cooperation with allies compatible with Trump's America First policy? Are we past the era of credible American nuclear assurance? This maybe gets back a little bit to post-NSS, what allies and partners might be thinking.
I desperately hope we are not past the stage of reliable extended nuclear deterrence, because what I think the consequences of that would be are dramatic nuclear proliferation, dramatic strategic instability, and a much higher likelihood of wars that by not deterring, we will end up getting either dragged into or dealing with consequences where other countries set rules of order internationally that the US is compelled to honor. I think those are all bad outcomes, all worse outcomes than sustaining the extended deterrence that's present. But I share Gabriella's suspicion that that's not where the Trump administration is.
Oh, that's a deeply concerning way to end this for Australia. But I would say that, serious questions do exist about extended nuclear deterrence. That said, I think we should not underestimate the very, very strong preference of allies and most of the region to work with and for the US to believe in the US as a power for good in the region and as a stabiliser. We all desperately do want that to happen, and we want to play our part in making sure that they do. So I think that's important, holding on to that sort of the idea. This moral equivalence argument that has crept into the debate in the region between the United States and China probably over the last decade, I think, is a win for propaganda and disinformation. And again, I think, I think that superficially you could really be misled and you could have a lot of concerns, but I think, you know, at the core of most of the nations and the policies and the politics of the region, there's faith in the United States.
That's a nice point to end on.
Any closing thoughts from you, Tom?
This great chapters, again, both of you really appreciated the comprehensive look at this. I'll just say very briefly on the Allied extended deterrence thing, I think there can only be one correct answer, that allies, and especially our adversaries, need to understand that the United States will be there, and on a bad day, they should not underestimate the American resolve if they sink an aircraft carrier, hit Pearl Harbor or something like that. So if they think they can play games with, you know, monkeying under the nuclear threshold, that's dangerous.
Well, thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists and discussing. And I think there's a brief 15-minute break for some coffee and snacks.
I have something to say to you.
What's less awkward?
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for the questions in the first round. That's the spirit, keep it up. Thank you all for coming back and joining for the second panel of this discussion, which is on managing escalation dynamics. It'll be the same routine as last time. We'll first hear from Adam Mount, who is an independent scholar. Adam has a, I think, really fantastic article recently out in International Security called Conventional Deterrence of Nuclear Use. Did I get that right? It's not too complicated, but so I would highly commend that article to everyone. It's really thought-provoking and pushes on this issue of the relationship between conventional nuclear and deterrence purposes, which I am sure we will get into in the discussion. And then the other panelist that we'll hear from is Kyle Balzer, who's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And Kyle was not one of the paper authors. However, his views align in many instances, but not all, with Matthew Koslow and his paper. And so Kyle will say a little bit about what's in that paper, but also his own views, and I've encouraged him to expand on his own views because he has also written about this quite extensively and thought about it a lot. And then we'll turn it over to Aaron Dumbacher, who is the Stanton Nuclear Security Senior Fellow at Council on Foreign Relations, and then open it up to you all for the conversations. Just to give you a heads up, the questions that we will be covering in this panel are: what role could military tools play in escalation management and in securing U.S. political and military goals in a potential conflict? So that's on military tools. And then the same question, but on diplomatic tools. And I think this is where we're really going to get into some of the areas of disagreement among the 5 papers. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. To get us started, Adam, over to you.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Heather, for continuing the Project Adam tradition. Thanks to Lachlan and Elena and everyone else. It's a major investment for CSIS, I'm sure. But the strength of these reports has always been that they contrast a range of reasonable and informed views, and this one's no different. I've relied on past Project Adam reports and really appreciate you putting in the time. So we had a number of really fascinating and I think perceptive conversations in the first panel about the relationship between nuclear and conventional forces. This is something that I tried to take head on in my piece. U.S. officials and U.S. experts generally see nuclear and conventional deterrence as complementary. But recently, concerns about an eroding margin of conventional advantage have caused some nuclear policy experts to turn to nuclear weapons to try to make up that gap, to try to increase reliance on U.S. nuclear forces to manage escalation challenges in the Indo-Pacific. So some American experts have also recommended new nuclear programs to compensate for declining confidence in U.S. extended deterrence. So these 2 major trends, both decreasing confidence in U.S. conventional capability and decreasing confidence in the region and U.S. political leadership, pose a double challenge for U.S. deterrence strategists. So while we often think about nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence as complementary, I want here to concentrate on a couple of the trade-offs between the two. I want to focus on 3 ways that increased nuclear reliance has significant disadvantages for managing a potential conflict over Taiwan. Disadvantages for strategic bargaining, for operational planning, and for alliance management issues. So in all 3 of these cases, increased nuclear reliance, I argue, might complicate or inhibit the ability of the United States to manage escalation in the region, to maintain conventional denial and alliance cohesion. Now, importantly, these disadvantages become more severe in circumstances where U.S. conventional denial and alliance cohesion are coming into doubt. So, unfortunately, a decision to increase reliance on nuclear forces might have, paradoxically, exactly the opposite effects that we're hoping for. So let's look first at strategic disadvantages. First, let me highlight something that Beck said on the first panel. The communication of confidence is so important to deterrence credibility. What does increased reliance on nuclear weapons signal? I would worry that increased reliance on nuclear forces could unintentionally signal that US officials lack confidence in their ability to deny China's objectives using conventional forces and their resolve to do so. So China may interpret increased nuclear reliance as a signal that US officials will hesitate to commit sufficient conventional forces to the defense of Taiwan to prevail on the battlefield, or that the United States may be more likely to withdraw its forces earlier in a conflict. Second, increased nuclear reliance could raise nuclear escalation risks. If Beijing believed that ongoing conventional operations of dual-capable forces or US conventional forces were a prelude to a nuclear attack or a start of a strategic attack, they might have an increased incentive to preempt that attack in the first place. So Chinese officials may be more susceptible to misperception or more liable to preempt in circumstances where the United States is increasing its reliance on nuclear forces. And third, it's possible, at least in my view, that Beijing may prefer to face a United States that's more reliant on nuclear forces. They might calculate, for example, in the event of a nuclear exchange, even a limited one across the Taiwan Strait, that they would come out ahead because the United States would face disproportionate diplomatic and economic costs to a nuclear conflict. Let's turn now briefly to some of the military disadvantages. Again, usually US strategists think of nuclear and conventional deterrence as complementary, but in some ways, increasing nuclear reliance may decrease the capability of conventional forces. So through trade-offs between nuclear and conventional reliance, we rarely sort of discuss these trade-offs, but they could shape the options available to US commanders in a conflict. Over the medium term, new nuclear-capable systems would further exacerbate pressures that we have on the development of dual-capable systems and conventional-only systems. This is in terms of both budgetary constraints and design decisions about how you arm, how you posture, what are the requirements that you put into very expensive, big-ticket, dual-capable military items. There are major trade-offs at the level of force posture and operational planning. So bombers and their support packages, so conventional aircraft, tankers, ISR assets, that are reserved for nuclear signaling, for nuclear delivery in a conflict, cannot be committed to a conventional fight. VLS cells, vertical launch systems on attack submarines that are armed with SLICM nuclear, so a sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, cannot carry conventional munitions in a fight. Both of these things, the bombers that are available for a Taiwan conflict and the number of Tomahawks that we have over the strait, are things that US commanders identify as crucial determinants of how that conflict turns out. Lastly, commanders may be more hesitant to deploy nuclear-armed assets in certain combat roles. So dual-capable and non-nuclear ships and aircraft are more likely to be misperceived as nuclear-capable in a conflict if we're increasing our reliance on nuclear forces. And US commanders might understandably be hesitant to deploy those forces forward in a crisis if they're carrying nuclear warheads. So let me lastly briefly touch on disadvantages for alliance management. In recent decades, US allies have been clarion clear that they consider extended nuclear deterrence to be stabilizing, reassuring, and even critical to their security. However, there are a number of ways that reliance on US nuclear capabilities has already reduced the cohesion of these alliance relationships, complicated combined planning, namely because the conversations that we have with allies about nuclear weapons take place on a different register. We don't share as much information about nuclear operations as we do about conventional plans. So these conversations can end up being a little delicate and a little sensitive. And so it's more difficult to do combined deterrence planning and combined warfighting planning with our allies if we're relying more on conventional capabilities. So combined conventional deterrence posture is strengthened by combined operational planning, by forward deployed conventional units in the region, and joint development projects. All three of these are more difficult for nuclear-capable systems than they are for conventional-only systems. The central problem is that the more an alliance depends on nuclear forces for escalation management, the more dependent an ally is on a decision of a US president to order nuclear use in conditions that the ally considers it advisable. The United States does not commit to use nuclear weapons in any particular circumstance and never will. And so allies are understandably left with this anxiety. When would a US president decide to cross the nuclear threshold? In normal times, in past decades, this was always a concern. But if the judgment or the commitment of US leadership is increasingly called into question, this becomes a major liability. So if a US president is threatening to withdraw conventional forces, increasing reliance on nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities might look more like offshore balancing to allies as a way to sort of superficially meet our deterrence commitments without the challenge and without the burden of having to commit conventional forces to defense and denial. The sum total from my perspective is there is no substitute for having a credible and strong conventional denial capability and having cohesive, effective alliance coordination. To the extent that increasing our reliance on nuclear capabilities could decrease both conventional denial and alliance cohesion, it poses increasing challenges for these problems that we're facing and could actually make matters worse rather than better.
Great, thanks so much, Adam. Kyle, over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you to Heather and the entire CSIS team, the PONI team, for inviting me here to talk, comment about this year's Project Adam report. And I'm especially grateful to share on this panel with Adam and Aaron. The annual Project Adam reports have always greatly, I think, enriched my own thinking about nuclear deterrence. And this is certainly, I think, no less the case than this year's, especially with Matthew Koslow's paper. As Heather pointed out, unfortunately, Matt couldn't be with us here today. So I really want to kind of dig into his contribution. I think it should be widely read by anyone working on deterrence issues in the Western Pacific, but especially those of us working on nuclear deterrence issues. So I very much encourage everyone to read it if you haven't already done so. And so I could talk about his paper at great length, so I want to make sure I stick to my bullet points here. But to my mind, one of the vital points Matt makes in his paper is that he characterizes deterrence, nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence as itself. It's a risk reduction measure, and really deterrence is going to be America's primary risk reduction measure, at least for this foreseeable future, I think, with China. Risk reduction, I think in some cases, can at times be too often narrowly reduced to either arms control, arms reduction, or even nuclear disarmament. For instance, that is that the idea that less nuclear weapons in the world means less nuclear danger, or that limiting nuclear weapons limits inherently nuclear danger, or at the very least that more nuclear weapons just raises the danger, or it leads the way, opens pathways to maybe a destabilizing arms race. I think, to my mind, and Matt and I have written about this, that the historical record doesn't bear that out, and especially with trends now in the Western Pacific, the Asia Pacific with China, I think the trends don't bear those conclusions out. And this is a point I think that Matt underscores very nicely in his paper, and he does so, I think, for two main reasons, which I think are important for me to note today. The first is that when it comes to nuclear weapons, Beijing has really refused meaningful dialogue, I think, with the United States, its allies, and its partners, really the world. For instance, I think late November, Beijing released a white paper on arms control, non-proliferation, which I think in some respects was helpful, but I think they still haven't really discussed with us or anyone really where their nuclear weapons program is going, what their larger nuclear ambitions are. And so as Matt notes, Beijing has proven itself to value being opacity over dialogue and diplomacy. And on this point, I think here it's worth to really quote Matt at length directly from his paper. He writes that in the absence of China's willingness to talk, the United States is forced to consider how it can best defend its national interests, its allies, its partners in the Indo-Pacific, while demonstrating to China that it has more to gain through cooperation than competition, especially military competition. And here, to me, at least, lies the central part of our problem with China today. Because getting from military competition to cooperation with China, in my view, will be unlikely, at least for the foreseeable future. Because as Matt points out, when it comes to things like the future of Taiwan, China's interests and America's interests and those of Japan or the Philippines and the larger world, our European partners, those interests are diametrically opposed to each other. So given that China prefers being opaque to diplomacy and dialogue, and given that our natural interests with China clash so sharply, I think Matt quite rightly concludes that there are very few off-ramps right now with China. There are very few deals to be made, especially with nuclear arms control. So strengthening our military power, strengthening our nuclear deterrence, our conventional deterrence, is really going to be the primary way for the United States, I think, to minimize the risk of conflict, and if deterrence should fail, to extend deterrence into such an armed conflict. And this deterrence, I think, it must be made clear to China that the cost of aggression outweighs the benefits. And to my mind, at least, this deterrence really needs to be tailored to China's, distinctive belief system, its distinctive perceptions in the Western Pacific, really its peculiar kind of behavioral tendencies. So all this really, I think, begs the question to what role military tools are going to play in managing escalation, in shoring up deterrence and controlling escalation, say if a war breaks out, and how exactly can these military tools be tailored, I think, to China's unique, distinctive belief system and the peculiar habits of mind it has that seem to clash with our own. And here I think Matt's treatment is really first rate of all these issues. I want to go into some specifically because his paper focuses really essentially on deterring a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and his tailored deterrent targets specifically, it's tailored to China's apparent confidence that it can set the pace of military operations along the first island chain and across really the first 2 or 3 island chains, really, because China's whole theory of victory really relies on what Chinese strategists refer to as effective control or war control. And this theory of victory really has potentially built up a view in Beijing, or built up a growing confidence in China that it can control the timing, the scale, the scope of escalation in such a war over Taiwan. That is, that the People's Liberation Army may be led to believe that it can essentially dominate the U.S. military, those militaries of our partners. It can rapidly absorb Taiwan, achieve a fait accompli, and then rapidly achieve a war termination over a conflict with Taiwan. And so I agree with Matt. What Matt really does here in his paper is that he suggests that American planners need to neutralize, upend China's whole theory of victory, that theory of effective control or war control. He says that we should really disabuse Beijing of its confidence that it can better control escalation than the United States can. And the best way for us to do that, and I completely agree with Matt on this point, is that we should deploy military capability that can convince Beijing that it is actually us, the United States, our allies and partners, not China, that can better control escalation, that can better, I don't know if dominate the escalation ladder is the correct way of putting it, but that can better control its nuclear forces flexibly and employ them if needed in a flexible and diverse manner. And at the same time, while reducing damage or risks to us and our allies and partners. And now to be clear on this point, Matt is not arguing for nuclear forces, conventional forces, for escalation's sake. I think rather the goal should be, and as Matt writes, our goal should be to really deploy capability, military capability that convinces Beijing that it cannot achieve a rapid war termination. It cannot control escalation. And that if Beijing does initiate such a war, that America has the superior capability, asymmetric capability to really dish out punishment that will grab Beijing's attention and really, as I said, limit damage to ourselves. And so just to close things up here, I think Matt points to some investments, some military procurement of hardware and delivery systems that I think can accomplish these goals and stir these kind of visceral feelings in the mind, China's unique way of looking at, I think, the first island chain in the Western Pacific. Matt points to China's, pretty rapid and serious investment in theater and regional nuclear capabilities. He mentions in particular the DF-26, the so-called Guam killer, that can really, I think, poses the risk in both in our minds, Washington's mind, and our allies' mind, that we will be decoupled from the Western Pacific in defending our allies. We're pretty bare right now, I think, especially in the nuclear domain. We're pretty bare in terms of our regional nuclear capability. And I think this could really goad China into running risks that it knows it will be running. But I think this could open up a pathway to bolster Beijing's confidence that it can achieve that war control it wants. So Matt emphasizes things like accelerating SLICM-N, which I can't, foot stop enough. We need SLICM. We need to right size that imbalance in the region. I don't think relying on the W76-2 is enough. I think, when Columbia comes online, we're going to be taking a 40% cut in our SLBM launchers, which with China are going to have to cover, I think, those new silo fields. And we can't forget, we also need SLBMs to handle Russia and deter Russia as well. So I don't think SLICM's enough. Matt also suggests that we should think about an air-launched ballistic missiles on surface ships. I myself, I'm not sure if I'm quite there yet. I agree with it in principle, but I think with our industrial base, everything we need to build up in terms of our conventional forces and military forces, I think all boats really need to rise at once. And so that may tax our nuclear enterprise too much, fielding air-launched ballistic missiles, surface ballistic missiles. But I agree in principle with his point there. And I may also throw in my own kind of thinking, which Beijing really seems to be impressed with long-range bomber capability. It doesn't have that yet. We're right now the only power that's in the strategic bomber business in terms of global strike. Since the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969, when the Soviets were running their bombers at China's border, that really got Beijing's attention, and ever since it's building deeply buried shelters, tunneling in the mountains. It's obsessed with tunneling, and it's obsessed with long-range bomber capability. And I think this fear was really fueled by our kind of performance over the skies of Iraq and Kosovo in the 90s. So we should really manipulate that fear, I think. And what would that take? I think it would take ramping up B-21s. Our bomber force is going to be taxed, running conventional operations, and so it's really going to be severely taxed on the nuclear side as well. And if we're going to maintain our global interests, I think across 3 theaters, across Eurasia and Europe, Middle East, East Asia, we need more B-21s. I don't think there's any other way around it. So whatever needs to be done with the defense industrial base, I think, really needs to happen. I'd also just throw in that given China's unique, peculiar fear of long-range bombers, I think it's worth taking a look at expanding the LRSO program, getting an LRSO, I think, for every mounting point, and B-52Hs and B-21s. And so on the defensive end of the spectrum, Matt points out the need for homeland and regional missile defense capabilities. Homeland defense, I think, in my view, would show China that there's no limited strategic strike on our homeland that would be cheap for China. It would raise the threshold for escalation and therefore manage escalation, I think. And with regards to our theater missile capability, I think it would help us defend our high-value targets in the region on the first island chain, second island chain, things like air bases, all the facilities we need to flow forces into the region. I think that would help with the fear that the DF-26 is going to decouple us from the region. And this would bolster reassurance, I think, with our allies. And I may have gone over my time thus far, but I'll close out with the diplomatic dimension of Matt's paper. He mentions that there is opportunities over the long term with diplomacy and political tools of escalation management, but in the near term here, we're really in a world of the military dimension of deterrence. And he suggests that we can have the looming threat of crippling economic sanctions with China could have a non-military deterrence effect, which I completely agree with. But I'll just, as my last point, I think that trends in our diplomatic relations with allies will need to do so, such as with Europe and even in Asia, I think are heading in the wrong direction. We'll have to reverse those trends to get economic relations in such a point where we'll have a united kind of sanctions regime that we can really level with China. And so with that, I'll just hand it back to Heather.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to you all for the questions that are coming in. Reminder, use the QR code if you haven't already put in a question and you want to contribute. Before I turn to those, Erin, over to you for some reflections on what you heard in the papers themselves.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you and to join the discussion, even though I didn't do the homework of writing out a full piece myself. So I want to start with a few overall reflections on the report and then come to each of you perhaps with some follow-up questions of my own based on my own research and experience. So first off, I want to really applaud the piece as a whole for raising, again, I think some, I'll call them Cold War era theoretical discussions that I do think have much more merit in today's conversation than perhaps we were grappling with in recent decades. So I'll put at the top of the list the stability and stability paradox, to use the most theoretical term. But then within that, I think there's potential for protraction in a scenario like this. And I do not think that the defense industrial base and that the U.S. defense enterprise writ large today is prepared for that, full stop. And I think that this report actually reminds us that there's a world in which protracted war is actually an outcome that we might target in some scenario because we might choose to not use a nuclear weapon. And I think that we can think about these distinct outcomes as driving our defense planning and resourcing, as Corey said on the earlier panel, that as a potential that frankly in a global war on terror sort of scenario, I don't think quite raised to the fore. We were talking and investing in precision guided munitions and things like that. Protracted war, we have not done in the United States since World War II. And there's a terrific George Marshall quote that's actually in Garrett Graff's new book about nuclear developments, where he talks, and I'm paraphrasing here, forgive me, he says something along the lines relative to Nazi Germany, authoritarians have an advantage at the beginning of a war, but democracies over time have the ability to bolster and harness all of their advantages to actually fight and win over the long run. And I think that if we are truly talking about strategic competition and great power competition and great power war, some of those potential targets need to be factored into some of our planning and preparations. If for no other reason, again, as I say, to not tip the scales and cross a nuclear threshold. As I think the leaders of both the US, China, and all nuclear weapon states, by the way, have agreed that they do not believe that a nuclear war can be won. And therefore, it should not be fought. And so I think with that as sort of the guiding strategic objective, let's say, as we discuss escalation, I applaud you for renewing the conversation about protraction. I also think, of course, there's remarkable comments here about allied cohesion. I do think we need to be clear-eyed about where things stand today, and allies can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're starting to see the dawn of a new era of what it looks like if the US retreats in some way when it comes to extended deterrence commitments. And I think the new national security strategy is just one more reminder of that. Okay, so those are some of my overall conversations. I would love to, Adam, start with your article and some follow-up questions for you. I think your article for me raised the issue of whether or not the US would risk escalation to the strategic level at all. And I was particularly taken with some of your conversation about limited nuclear use in a Taiwan contingency. And of course, my mind then went to issues like radiological effects to push back against an amphibious assault and things like that. And I just wonder how you think about those potential options, both at that, what I would call theater use, but then perhaps also at the strategic use. A second question is, the role of nuclear weapons. I think I applaud you for matching conventional deterrence to this broader issue of what is the place of nuclear weapons in US strategy. Whatever that role looks like from a strategic level has to be enforced and enacted through strategy plans and resourcing. And I wonder what your impression of that is today and what it perhaps should look like moving forward. And then finally, and this is a related point, if we take as a given that declaratory policy in the United States, even if a new national defense strategy comes out and has some nuclear posture review-like language, I think all signs are pointing to that there might not be a full nuclear posture review, which by definition means there's less language available to both reassure allies and make some other sort of declaratory policy statements. If it's unlikely that US declaratory policy is going to be sufficiently specific to manage some of the issues that we talk about here, what else could the United States do from as a policy matter if declaratory policy is sort of off the list? Putting you in the unfair position of asking you questions about a paper you did not write yourself, I will posit a few reactions to Matt's paper and then ask you perhaps to respond to some of these questions. First of all, I was taken with the article's combination and sort of emphasis on the importance of combination of diplomatic and military capabilities to achieve aims in a crisis. And I think that bears repeating as many times as we possibly can, especially if we're having debates and discussions about defense policy and military capabilities, that the diplomatic piece has to be invested in. And that also, of course, has talent and resourcing implications, I would emphasize. And by the way, diplomatic means historically, since the dawn of the nuclear age, I would argue, have in fact been paired with military capabilities to manage escalation. And so I applaud that piece. I wonder, however, your emphasis in your comments and also the article sort of asks the question of whether or not our current toolkit on the diplomatic side is going to be sufficient. How would you modify that to actually build stronger links? Agree with a lot of the pessimism about the the state of play, if you will, between US and PRC, even military to military communications. I think Corey on the earlier panel was right to say they don't pick up the phone when we call. I mean, all of this is not just lore, I think it's fact. But I think that there's opportunity now, as we are preparing, perhaps in a 2-year contingency, and if we're preparing for a 2027 fight or a fight later, to actually improve. We have an opportunity, we have a window to think about what should actually be done there, with the recognition that the PRC will never be able to draw on the literal decades of experience the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia have to develop and practice and exercise and understand and signal and message to one another what exactly we mean by a particular move or an exercise or what have you, and what that means from a strategic stability perspective, if we can use that term. So that's my first big question for you. The second, I was happy to see, and in your comments, I appreciate that you were specific about particular military capabilities that might meet the need here that the paper outlines. But how do you, I think we still have to grapple with the discrimination problem, especially in a crisis and with escalatory risk. How do you deal with the discrimination problem of theater nuclear weapons, SLICM-N among them, if we also have weak military to military communications and trust deficits, et cetera, with our strategic competitor? And then finally, the point, going back to my earlier statements about protraction, I think the article says that protraction favors the PRC because of their industrial-based capabilities. And different, and that I think is likely true. It especially is true if there's a fight in 2 years versus beyond. But what are the tangible steps that the United States should take to overcome that favorability for the PRC industrial base? I think that includes, and we can talk more about this, and Adam mentioned unmanned capabilities in his article. I think that includes looking to more emerging capabilities, maybe more off the shelf, maybe more attritable capabilities, precise mass types of options to help us. And there's a new, I think Eric Greenberg's book was just published talking about how drones actually add a rung to the so-called escalatory ladder, which is a metaphor I still hate to use, but it adds a rung and perhaps can help us to manage and signal in a different way, rather than, I think the conventional wisdom had been that some of these emerging capabilities actually send us up a ramp to escalate, and I think the data is not proving that out as of yet. So what exactly, and thinking again here also about the PRC's advantages when it comes to supply chain and rare earth minerals and critical minerals and all of the rest, which by the way, to solve, we need our ally support. What are the tangible steps to really overcome any PRC advantage for a protracted scenario in the industrial base area?
So I'll turn it over to you guys if you want to respond to Aaron's questions, and then we can open it up a bit.
So I'll start with the third question first on the issue of protraction and China's maybe asymmetric advantage with its industrial-based prowess compared to the state of our own. I agree with the assessment that there's an asymmetry there. And I also agree with your assessment that any conflict will be protracted and likely even global. So in handling that asymmetric disadvantage that we may have there is we're already in the global power projection business. We have a global system of allies. I think there's a potential to offset our industrial-based weakness with escalating a conflict horizontally. China has global infrastructure. It would not want to lose, obviously. Its ambitions do not stop with Taiwan. They extend to basically supplant the United States as the global rule setter. So I think that's one opportunity for expanding the B-21 bomber program. Maybe looking at what our special forces can do in terms of raiding facilities that stretch as far back as Africa, for instance. China has one military base. It's in Africa. It's exposed to our power projection capabilities. I think, India will never, I think, sign up for a formal treaty with us, especially with, we're imposing tariffs, 50% tariffs on them. They're especially not going to be with us now. I think in the future, if China starts to do aggressive things on their borders, I think we should look at the potential for, we already exercise our special forces with them. We don't base them there, but we exercise them. There's historical precedent for building that relationship further. In 1962, after the Sino-Indian border war, we ramped up covert programs to fuel Tibetan resistance. So that's an opportunity to offset our defense industrial base problem and maybe turn a protracted conflict into our advantage. Now, I admit those opportunities aren't appealing, but as a global conflict, as a conflict spills over into other regions, as red lines are crossed, those may be options for us. Two, on the problem of discrimination, I think that, it is an issue, but we can't forget that China also isn't doing much to help us out with discrimination. It has dual use theater range missile systems that can quickly swap in and out, conventional and nuclear. David Logan wrote a very interesting paper, Is China reading Thomas Schelling in terms of the entanglement issue? It appears, at least at that time in 2022 when the piece was published, that China doesn't really entangle so much its conventional nuclear warheads. What it does do, though, is those missile brigades, they exercise and roam China to the point where they could potentially entangle nuclear and conventional forces. So I think the blame can't just be all on us. Both sides have an entanglement issue, and both sides haven't been doing a lot to deal with it. Does that mean China's not too concerned about it? Maybe sees it as an advantage, maybe. So maybe we should lean into the discrimination problem, manipulate the issue, especially with SLICMN comes online. I think theater nuclear use is most credible when our conventional and nuclear forces are integrated. That makes the other side think that we will employ nuclear weapons. So I think maybe there's an opportunity to lean into the discrimination issue. And then with the first question, what's our diplomatic game plan? How does that connect with military strategy? I think, it's worth looking at the early 1980s with the Reagan administration. They weren't doing a lot of public diplomacy. As the historian Simon Miles points out, they were doing a lot of under-the-table, quiet diplomacy. So as they were locking in military superiority over the Soviets by, I think, 85, 86, we really locked in some asymmetric advantages. That's when we really made our diplomacy public. And of course, Gorbachev came on the scene. He was more willing to listen, but he was willing to listen really, I think, as Miles shows, once we had that military advantages that we did have. So I think, yes, we should be doing a lot of quiet diplomacy now with China. I think it's good if they don't pick up the phone. I think maybe there's opportunities to show that we're calling them, to talk about how we call them, and they don't pick up. I think it's also good if our diplomats, are left, waiting at meetings. I think Anthony Blinken at one point was left waiting in a meeting with China. I don't think that's embarrassing for us. I think that's good. I think it shows the world that we're interested in this. The other side's not interested in it. So I think that quiet diplomacy linked with building up our defense industrial base would be pretty important.
Adam, any reactions?
Sure. Excellent questions from Aaron. I keep going back and forth on which one I should start with. But let me start with the first. So would the US escalate to the nuclear level in a conflict over Taiwan? The most plausible scenario that I've heard experts develop, Bridge Colby worked on it, and then Greg Weaver, have talked about a US limited nuclear strike on collection points in the Taiwan Strait where Chinese forces are marshaling to progress to beachheads and to ports on Taiwan. Would that pose a lucrative target for US nuclear strikes? There are two questions that I think are critical here. The first is, would that be decisive in changing the outcome of a conflict over Taiwan? And I think there's some real questions here. One, China would have a pretty significant incentive to disperse its forces and to prevent falling into a circumstance where they're supremely vulnerable to a single aim point. I think that's probably unlikely. I think it becomes even more difficult if the US has to consider multiple nuclear strikes in the Taiwan Strait because of the second point. Would a US president want to authorize nuclear use in that sort of circumstance? I can imagine a US president calculating that it would be a viable military target. But one of the outcomes of this IS paper that I just put out is that when you talk to former US officials, they evince extreme reticence to go to the nuclear level. I think the critical sort of takeaway here is, even if there would be a target that was effective and consequential, which I'm not entirely convinced of, a US president would not want to be in that situation. The last situation they would want to be in is where they have no other choice to authorize nuclear use or to lose. And so if we're in a world where there's a trade-off between how much we spend on nuclear weapons and how much we spend on conventional weapons, on how we posture our forces, on how we prepare them to operate, where we position them, then we want to think seriously about prioritizing the mission that a US president would want to rely on the most credible form of deterrence, which is denial, rather than assume that shifting to nuclear reliance would be a sufficient compensation. And here I want to get to the third point that you raised. What if we don't do a nuclear posture review, and where do we stand? I think before the administration took office, you saw sort of a groundswell among nuclear scholars, including Frank Miller and Madeline Creedon, who I know are friends of the project here, in foreign affairs, that said, don't do nuclear posture review, let's just get on with building more capabilities. We know that we need more material. Let's not sort of muddy the waters with going through the NPR process, which I think is, I think recent sort of episodes have shown is pretty problematic and pretty unwieldy in the best of times. I think the unfortunate consequence of that is that it doesn't allow you that planning and evaluation and sort of studies process that allows senior political officials to commission studies from the combatant commands and DOD to help answer these really difficult intellectual questions. One is, what is the relative role of conventional and nuclear forces? When might we use either? Where do we want to put the next marginal dollar? What are the risks of relying on nuclear capabilities more? What's the most effective deterrent? The other big question is, what do we do about a sort of tripolar deterrence relationship? What are the requirements on US nuclear forces for holding at risk aim points in both Russia and China simultaneously? Do we have enough? How much would it take? This is an extraordinarily difficult intellectual question and strategic question that I don't think the Biden administration answered. And without that kind of review process, it doesn't offer you the sort of venue or the opportunity to tackle these really difficult questions. And so the only option that you give yourself is just to build more. And the difficulty with that is it doesn't sort of bring you into these sort of cost-benefit calculations, into considerations about where strategic utility lies most, how allies feel about this shift in policy. I think it's unwise, hasty, and doesn't set us up to best answer the challenges that we face, which are immense.
Thank you both for that. So I'm going to kick off the Q&A. We're getting some great questions coming in, but I'm going to very politely and respectfully disagree with both of you on specific points, just to spice it up a little bit.
Great.
So Adam, from both your Project Adam paper I think particularly in your IS article, and you just repeated the point now, you said how decision makers feel like they don't have a lot of options. And in your IS piece, you interviewed, 20 former senior political and military officials and did kind of a tabletop with them, which I thought was really great research method in getting that kind of firsthand knowledge. Like it was a very cool project. But if I'm mischaracterizing those conversations or what you just said, then please do clarify. The counter argument I would make is, well, if they want more options, then we need more nuclear options. We need lower yield, more flexible, potentially more usable nuclear options, not just doubling down on conventional. And the way that you present the argument does come across as like nuclear and conventional are mutually exclusive, whereas I think I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I see it as more, you just need more flexible nuclear options. So I'm wondering how you would respond to that one. And then to Kyle, continuing on the conversation about different options and kind of different optionality, I appreciate that you said you were a little skeptical about the ALBMs and Matt's idea there, but you did still list, so speed up on SLCM-N, which I agree with, more SLBMs, maybe an ALBM, more B-21s, and expanding LRSO. And I keep I want to tease out Aaron's question a bit more, which is, can we actually do all those things? Can we afford all those things? If you had to pick where you put your prioritization, what are you going to go for?
The prioritization, I think we're weakest at the theater level. So SLCM-N, I would accelerate it, and I would, if it's possible, you hear different things from different people. If it's possible to put a W-80 on, a TLAM, if that's possible, certified crews, get them training, I understand all that things need to happen, but I think we're weakest at the theater level. And I think getting a sea launch capability would be where I would put my effort.
Okay. Adam, what are your thoughts on whether or not we just need more nuclear options?
Thanks. Yeah, that's not what the data showed in the project that I came up with, or that we worked through. So interviewing 20 former senior officials who served in defense positions and in political appointees, 17 out of 20 believed that they could meet their objectives in this specific crisis with non-nuclear capabilities, with a conventional response to a nuclear threat and conventional deterrence to prevent a nuclear, excuse me, that's not quite right. So 17 out of 20 believe that a conventional response was preferable to a nuclear response. Mm-hmm. But 11 out of 20 believe that conventional deterrence would be sufficient to deter that strike in that circumstance. And so the finding wasn't as simple as more nuclear capabilities would solve the problem. The takeaway that I took was former US officials are deeply reticent to resort to nuclear use and believe that they can meet their physical and psychological effects necessary to deter nuclear use and respond to it with non-nuclear forces. So one of the takeaways for me from a policy perspective is, before sort of jumping to this conclusion that more nuclear capabilities are necessary, we need to carefully evaluate whether our non-nuclear forces are sufficient to manage even these pretty severe nuclear crises with nuclear-armed adversaries.
Do you think that those are mutually exclusive, or can we do them both at the same time?
It's a great question. And the paper that I wrote for PONI and the IS paper doesn't sort of get into all of the resourcing implications of selecting one force posture over another. The points that I would want to highlight here are, there are resourcing and force posture trade-offs to be made. And we need to very deliberately make a decision, a deliberate and rational decision about how we want to deter escalation, how we want to manage escalation in the Taiwan Strait. And a little more of a little bit everything isn't a very rational strategy.
Before I go to Aaron, I'm just going to point out something where if Greg Weaver were here, I think he would agree with you, which is we need a strategy before we even, I'm being a little bit unfair, being like, pick your winner, because it's like, what's the strategy that is going to drive that? And the Strategic Posture Commission highlighted that. I think every conversation I've had about the Strategic Posture Commission since it came out was, right, where's the strategy? The strategy has to drive all of this. The strategy also has to drive arms control. And I'm still waiting to see the strategy, but maybe the NDS will have it in there. But I kind of hear you saying the same thing, which is we need an escalation management strategy, and that's what then should drive those trade-off decisions.
And one of the things that I would want to highlight here is Madeleine Creedon and other senior members of the Strategic Posture Commission were very clear when they said that conventional denial and conventional capabilities are crucial for deterring conflict over Taiwan. The next sentence, however, said, if we don't have those capabilities, we may have to rely more on nuclear. And I just think we need to think very seriously about thinking about that as a natural next step or as a sufficient substitute.
Erin, you wanted to jump in.
I want to point out respectfully that it's not, I think it's a little bit of a false choice to choose among simply a basket of nuclear capabilities that are without conversations about platforms. And without conversations about platforms that are 81% over budget and multi-year delays. Right? I mean, I also heard you emphasize the importance of the submarine modernization. I mean, I think we can in the nuclear policy community have lots of debates about LRSO versus SLCMN versus what have you. But I think there's probably a lot of consensus that we really need to make sure that the big platform modernization projects are online. And those, by the way, are much more costly and where we need to be putting the emphasis. And I don't think that we've solved any of the industrial base and the modernization issues. Oh, by the way, since we designed the modernization plan, the grand bargain, I would argue, for let's get New START through the Senate and let's move forward with modernization. New START expires in a month.
I'd also just add in on the resource issue, I think that you so rarely highlight. It's obviously not just a problem of money. It's a defense industrial base, acquisitions process, all of these things. It's money, acquisitions, throwing money into the defense industrial base. But I think at a more fundamental political level, I think we need national leadership to really start talking about all the threats we face loudly, from the presidential level to the entire cabinet. It's really kind of shocking to me, and this is bipartisan. This is not just current administration or last administration. It's a bipartisan problem. There just needs to be more of a national conversation about this. By 1974, 75, you had a former California governor talking about adverse trends in the Soviet American military balance. He gave really detailed speeches, radio speeches, public addresses on the state of the balance, how many tanks the Soviets have, how many fighter aircraft, this and that. That's just not happening today. And I think to get to a serious effort on acquisitions in the defense industrial base, Americans really need to understand, I think, the threats they face to a level. I don't think there's a whole lot of education going on at that fundamental level.
I think you just made a fantastic case for the China military power report and getting that information out there. But it also gets to what Beck was saying in the first panel about the need to challenge some Chinese disinformation and just be transparent. I mean, they're not being transparent, but being as transparent as we possibly can, obviously without getting into sources and methods, about what is it that Russia and China and DPRK are actually doing and kind of forcing the conversation. We have lots of questions coming in, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to group a couple of them together and turn it over to you all. So the first is a question I think I'd like all of you to answer, including Erin, if you want to. It comes from Andrew Carroll at Missouri State University. What do escalation dynamics look like in a world where existing U.S. nuclear capabilities continue to age with modernization programs behind schedule, 81% over budget, while conventional capabilities are prioritized for the Western Hemisphere? So that's a big question. But then I also am going to give one specifically for Adam and one specifically for Kyle. The one for Adam is, would an additional theater in Europe change your view about how the U.S. should rely on conventional versus nuclear weapons in the Taiwan conflict? And then for Kyle, how should China's growing arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons change our deterrence calculus in the Indo-Pacific? How might this be different from Cold War era strategic deterrence? So Adam, maybe we'll start with you and then go down the line.
Sure. What again, difficult challenge. The problem of multi-theater aggression is real. It's significant. It's much more of a constraint on conventional forces than it is on nuclear forces. The question is, does relying on nuclear forces in one theater, is it sufficient to solve the problem? I think it makes for a very thin deterrent. I think it makes for an unreliable deterrent. I don't think there is a substitute for having the ability to deny Chinese forces a foothold on Taiwan. And hoping that it will doesn't change the material or military facts of the contingency. And so the fact that we're in a difficult challenge shouldn't push us to sort of an easy or illusory answer.
And on the first question, which was on escalation dynamics when U.S. capabilities are aging and modernization programs are behind schedule?
Yeah, it's a very real challenge. And I think Aaron and also Kyle ably highlighted the challenge that we're in. The Air Force doesn't currently have a plan for the ICBM replacement, for the Sentinel program. It's 80% over budget, it's years behind schedule, and the certainty was at the outset was that as Minuteman starts to expire, it can't be life extended, and we're going to need the Sentinel to come online in a certain time frame. We are now blown way past that time frame. And so as Kyle highlights, some of these big ticket sort of foundational pieces of the nuclear triad are seriously imperiled. And tacking on additional capabilities will only complicate those programs more and more. In addition to programs for non-nuclear and dual capable forces. And so I think we ought to be very careful about pursuing this shopping list, even though it is, the holiday season. I don't think that we need to be very sort of careful and cognizant of the disadvantages of new nuclear capabilities, in addition to the limited advantages that they offer.
Kyle?
Differences between deterring China today and the new Cold War with the Cold War of yesteryear, I guess. I think in the near term, I think we can handle the problem and get by relatively well. I think, the main difference is the two nuclear peer threat and the fact that there's also that, two nuclear peer, plus problem of North Korea as well. So I think we can handle that. I think the main thing is, not extending New START, uploading ICBMs and SLBMs to ensure that in one theater we can respond in the worst case scenario to an all-out attack by China and be able to respond against those targets that China values most, while also holding Vladimir Putin at bay at the other end of Eurasia. And then under that window of our damage limitation capability that provides, as we've already talked about, right-sizing the theater nuclear balance is, I think, our biggest gap. I hate to use the word gap, but it's our biggest deterrence gap in the nuclear dimension. So I think that's how it's different. The two nuclear peer problem, we can't count out North Korea. Again, I think a slick amend would really help with that. It shows selectivity that we can target North Korea without, having to overfly any of our other adversaries. And so it's really the new dimension is that three-body problem that we're dealing with. And on that first question, I believe the Venezuela issue was thrown into that question. And I think I'd just say that, to my mind, I think we're expending very expensive munitions on these, narco trafficking boats. That would be, better dealt with the Coast Guard, empowering the Coast Guard to handle them. We need to, ensure that our European allies, and we should be helping Ukraine as well to stabilize Europe, and to ensure that we can maintain all the carriers we need in the Mediterranean, and I think at the Western Pacific, as opposed to handling narco trafficking boats in our own hemisphere.
Aaron, anything to add?
I would just say one of the things I'm looking for in the national defense strategy is this trade-off and the balance that you're alluding to in part of great power competition. And I think actually the prior panel referenced this issue too. Great power competition was not foremost among the list of priorities in the national security strategy, but if you look at the reconciliation bill, there was huge increases. Granted, it's a single single injection of funds, but huge funds moving to the Indo-Pacific for Indo-PACOM priorities, for space priorities, for cyber priorities, I mean, and for nuclear, including a sort of big hedge amount of funds for Sentinel and other things. So if that's where we're spending our money, and those are the investment choices that we are making, are we going backwards to develop a strategy? How do we make these two things align? And I think that careful balance between Western Hemisphere modernization. I also think that there are some challenges we have to acknowledge in our defense industrial base that injection of funds alone does not solve. I think I would put rare earth minerals on that list. I put critical issues. I put talent and workforce issues. It is not novel that we're sitting here still having a conversation on some level about how we get shipbuilding workforce to the point where we can build what we need, both for our AUKUS priorities and for our domestic priorities. So injection of funds alone won't do it. What are the new ideas and what are the strategies to meet our objectives?
Last question is I'm going to force us to talk a little bit, just talk about arms control and diplomacy. And the question that came through was about the expiration of New START and how that might impact your thinking. I'm going to tag on two sub-questions to it. The first one, should the Trump administration accept Vladimir Putin's offer to continue to observe New START limits for an additional year? And what does that gain or lose in terms of escalation management and the tools that we've been talking about? But the other component to it is I do want to draw on the one paper that we haven't talked a lot about and who isn't represented here, which is Mike Albertson's, which was on off-ramps. And I loved this paper. I thought it was really thought-provoking. And one of the recommendations that Mike made was that we should arms control and risk reduction remain really loaded terms. And they can kind of force people to go to their corners and go into their poles. And that instead of using those terms, we should be thinking about them as off-ramps. How can you identify inflection points during escalation when you can give both sides the opportunity to take a different path, which is in their political interest? And so it's not exactly arms control, because I think he makes a good case for why we have to be careful of using that term. But so just final thoughts on how does the expiration of New START impact this? Should the president accept the New START it's not extending New START, but the New START offer? And what do you think about the idea of off-ramps? Kyle, I'll go to you first. Sorry.
So New START, I think, as I said earlier, I think it needs to go. I think extending it would show a lack of national will on the United States part at a fundamental political level. The willingness to forego uploading SLBMs and ICBMs, I think, would show a lack of seriousness on our part. China has those 3 new silo fields in this northwestern desert. We need to show that we're serious about taking that emerging threat seriously. 2, I think, New START is based on really, I think, Cold War thinking about arms control. The main difference I mentioned between now and the Cold War of the past was it's a 3-body system now, and China needs to be brought into it. So I think extending New START for another year would show we're not serious about any of that.
Adam?
Yeah, in my view, the overall strategic balance has minor effects, if any, on our ability to manage escalation and theater contingencies. I think these kinds of signals are watched closely by allies for signals of U.S. political commitment and intentions. But the elephant in the room here is that they're terrified about the commitment of the Trump administration to their security, about the resolve and the capability of the president to focus on and manage these kinds of challenges. And any sort of decision about a new nuclear widget or an agreement with Russia is a rounding error compared to the significant anxiety that allies feel about the commitment of the president. And I think that's unfortunately well-founded and rational.
Erin, any thoughts?
I'm on the record. I wrote for CFR.org with my colleague John Drennan that the United States should not trade a New START extension in name only without verification for the advantages I think Russia is seeking on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think it's not worth trading a sort of in name only agreement without the very robust inspection and verification mechanisms that, and by the way, the commitment to not interfere with national technical means, which has benefits in information age, let's just say, for the benefit of sort of a Yalta-like foregoing of our commitments in Ukraine.
And just to close out, I can't help but add my 2 cents on this one. I'm actually quite interested. I think we're all in somewhat agreement on New START. To what extent would extending the limits really matter? For me, I don't think it's a good idea to extend it for 2 main reasons. One is it isn't actually what the president asked for in terms of arms control. And I'm not saying that the president should always get what he asks for when it comes to arms control. But his comments about denuclearization and pursuing arms control, he always includes China in the statement. He has never said about just doing a deal with Vladimir Putin. It's that China has to be part of that equation. And China is noticeably obviously absent. And as I think Kyle has mentioned, and Matt's paper goes into in detail, China just isn't open to this conversation. The second reason, which is why I'm just skeptical about arms control in general at the moment, which is weird because it's what I wrote my PhD dissertation on, so it's a strange moment. What leverage does the US have? Like, what do we actually have to put on the table to negotiate with? And I think it's that lack of leverage that at the moment just does not seem like it is a ripe environment for a good deal for the US. So just adding some additional skepticism to that. That does bring us to the end. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody online. I know we had really good numbers of online participation and viewership. Just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight what I think was the biggest takeaway for me from today's discussion, which actually wasn't a main theme in the report, which is why I love this. And a lot of it was actually Beck's points about communication. And it came up in this panel as well, and it's on the importance of communication, signaling confidence, we didn't even get into how transparent or ambiguous should we be in our own arsenal, because Adam's paper makes some really strong comments on that point. But the importance of communication and combating disinformation. And with that, I think a lot of us in the nuclear space are deeply anticipating the NDS. And this panel highlighted 3 things to watch for in the NDS for anybody else who's on tenterhooks about this. The first is, does it have an NPR? Does it have an explicit NPR, or is it a paragraph or something along those lines? A second thing to watch for is about modernization and the trade-offs. And I think Erin's comments actually captured that really nicely. We all talked about different trade-offs. Will the NDS weigh in on that? I'm a little bit skeptical based on what the NSF looks like, but you know, we could be surprised. And the last is where we ended on arms control. The president, as I hear his statements, has made it clear he wants an arms control agreement. This is a priority on top of ending the war in Gaza, ending the war in Ukraine. Where is the NDS going to land on that? What is the way forward for the administration going forward? So with that kind of closes our discussion about the Project Adam 2025 report. If you haven't already gotten one, I think I see a couple hard copies left back there, but you can also obviously get it online. In terms of next steps, there will actually be a roundtable recording this afternoon for the HTK series that Tom Carrico, who was here this morning, Carrie Bingen, and I do. We're going to be talking about the national security strategy. They were also at the Reagan Defense Forum, and I think they're going to have some really exciting and interesting takeaways from that. And the only other thing that I'll flag is a big part of what PONI does is about next generation work and our early and mid-career fellowship programs. So for anybody who isn't already involved in those programs, please come talk to us, send us emails, or make sure to apply. Finally is the thank yous. Thank you so much to the authors who are here, a few who couldn't join us, but I'm hoping are online. Thank you guys. I know that these papers go through a pretty rigorous process with a lot of workshopping and a lot of feedback, and it is a lot of work, and we just really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you in the room for asking questions and such a really exciting discussion. Thank you as always to CSIS AV team. And last but not least is thank you to the PONI team, in particular to Elena Sedens and Lachlan McKenzie for bringing everyone together. So thank you all so much.